and welcome to Required Viewing, Trends and Current Events. This is a new public affairs show here at IPFW, produced in a partnership between the Departments of History, Political Science, the American Democracy Project, and CATV. You can see episodes of this on CATV as well as through MDON through the Helmke Library's webpage. Required Viewing is hosted by Associate Professor of History Ann Livshiz and Assistant Professor of Political Science Andy Downs. Today we're going to be examining the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Our guest is Jim Lutz, Professor of Political Science at IPFW and also co-author of several books including, but not limited to, Terrorism, the Basics and Terrorism, Origins and Evolutions. Jim, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Let's start with a simple question. In the United States, we really value freedom quite a bit, but that can mean a little less security. So was a major terrorist attack in the United States somewhat inevitable?
I think that at some level a major attack was inevitable, and actually 9/11 wasn't the first one. The 1995 attempt on the World Trade Centers was an external attack, Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City a few years later. So in any democratic society, determined terrorists will be able to launch a major attack if they have the resources and dedication, and a democracy, not just the United States, but any democracy will have difficulty in preventing that in all cases. Sooner or later, something will happen. The Spanish discovered it, the British discovered it, we have discovered it.
Sure.
So was our response to the attacks appropriate?
I think our initial responses were appropriate in terms of pressuring the Taliban regime in Afghanistan to turn over bin Laden, to end their support for al-Qaeda in general, and even to the extent of taking a side with the Northern Alliance and sending military, minimal number of troops, but sending military troops to Afghanistan and becoming involved in that conflict. Clearly, I think, was probably appropriate given the nature of the attack and the devastating nature of it. Some of the other things that have been done in the aftermath of that are less appropriate. Iraq really had nothing to do with 9/11. So the involvement in Iraq, which may be good or bad in other terms, really had nothing to do with terrorism. Some of our support for regimes that suddenly their internal dissidents became terrorists, and therefore we supported them, was probably not well thought out or well conceived. In other cases, the dissident groups really were terrorists and they were connected with them, but we didn't seem to develop a very nuanced approach to dealing with persons who were labeled terrorists by various other governments. We tended to accept it as a matter of course, somewhat complicated by the fact that we needed to rely on Russia, for example, for access to Afghanistan, so we overlooked some minor semantic differences of definition in terms of Chechnya and other places.
So if you look at these responses, either initially or longer term, how did this change our international standing?
I think initially there was virtually global support for dealing with bin Laden and al-Qaeda, and even countries that had some doubts about U.S. involvement in Afghanistan accepted it as an inevitable consequence of 9/11. But the further down the road we got, the involvement in Iraq, which was linked to 9/11 and to the war on terrorism, was not well accepted. There were many other countries that our international standing declined as a result of that. Our support for governments that were battling terrorists, as they defined it, in some cases reduced our support. So I think over the course of time, there was a diminishment of U.S. standing in the global community. Some of that was bound to happen of necessity and would be unavoidable, but I think it diminished to a much greater extent. Some of the loss could have been avoided with more careful policies and more concern for the implications of what we were doing.
So, I mean, a related question would be, how did our response to the attacks affect our alliances around the world?
At one level, we've gotten more dissidence from our allies, again over Iraq, but over some other policies. But I think in general, the alliances have held up pretty well, even if there's been some less than friendly dialogue that has resulted. But the countries that we have strong alliances with value the alliances for a wide variety of reasons, and how we proceed with the war on terrorism is not likely to be one of the things that in and of itself would destroy an alliance. Our working relationship with Russia and some other countries, China, in the context of the global war on terrorism, really aren't alliances. Those are more fragile, and I think those kinds of working relationships have benefited or been damaged over the course of time, depending upon very specific circumstances, because there's not a solid base of past cooperation on a wide variety of issues. So those aren't exactly alliances. NATO is still pretty firm, and the recent events in Libya, where the United States and its European allies have collaborated and cooperated fairly effectively without much in the way of difficulties, would suggest that that alliance at least is pretty firm.
Any new allies that we've acquired as a result of this?
I think we've probably developed a better working relationship with China because it's facing troubles in the western portion of that country. Our relationship with Russia blows hot and cold depending upon the circumstances. I'm not sure I would say we've acquired a new ally in that regard. Probably, well, the Middle East is in flux right now, but our relationships over the course of time with at least some Middle Eastern countries, Egypt under Mubarak for a long period of time, that's now passed, but that clearly was a mutually advantageous relationship for many years. So that was strengthened as a consequence of the global war on terrorism and the U.S. need for a reliable, stable ally in the Middle East who would be better attuned to some of the things that were going on than the U.S. intelligence community would be.
And do you think those relationships, these are the ones that have grown stronger, the ones that have been diminished? How long-term is this effect that you're talking about right now?
Well, the relationship with Egypt was positive and long-term for a long time, but that's now obviously going to change with the new regime coming to power. I don't think we've developed any strong, powerful alliances because of 9/11, although in some respects it provided an opportunity for countries, for the United States in its relationships with China or Russia, with Russia, to get over some of the past problems. I mean, it provided an opportunity to say, okay, we'll start with not exactly a fresh sheet, but we're dealing with a very unique problem, and it provided an opportunity that otherwise wouldn't have existed because you couldn't get past the past as readily, except in the context of something as catastrophic as 9/11.
Mm-hmm. Now, in a democratic society, obviously you're always trying to balance out that freedom and security issue. How do we go about doing that? I mean, how do you decide what the balance, not you, because you're obviously not the person doing it, but how do we decide what that balance is between personal freedoms and a little more security?
Well, of course, there's no easy answer to that. Probably the starting point to look at the question is to realize that as horrendous as terrorist attacks are and the casualties that occur, relatively speaking, compared to other kinds of things, the cost isn't that high. Even 9/11, with all the casualties, more people murdered in the United States in a given year. It's just one at a time or 3 or 4 at a time, as the case may be. Traffic accidents, there's all kinds of things that actually constitute a greater threat to life and livelihood from some kind of violence than terrorist attacks do. We devote a tremendous amount of resources to terrorist attacks. So at some level, it's easy to argue that we really shouldn't have to give up too much in the way of freedom for greater security, because the insecurity in actual fact is not that great. Now, the psychological impacts are much greater, and terrorism is psychological warfare. 9/11 was a tremendous psychological blow. And then the anthrax scare that came along a month later added to it, and that was as great a psychological impact as it was because it was so close to 9/11 and because of the nature of the attack. Whoever was responsible, and FBI persons of interest notwithstanding, we can't be sure, whoever was responsible, if it was an effort to revitalize a personal career, then it had to be anthrax. But if it had been a true terrorist, they could have accomplished as much damage with letter bombs or a car bomb, not even in a crowded place. but it was a psychological impact of anthrax, and so we ended up having mail disrupted and running all kinds of letters through machine, and things got lost, and all kinds of things going on. So the psychological impact requires a response. It's not just the level of damage. And so I think that the kind of security measures we took went too far. They weren't necessary to deal with the level of threat. And in point of fact, there are ways around some of the things that we can't do, but European governments can do. They can do it. They can pass the information along to us, and we get all the advantages of European governments being able to do data mining on computer systems that the U.S. government can't do or legally cannot do, and probably doesn't do because the Germans have a supercomputer that does such a great job of it, and they're willing to share it.
Well, for many, the response of the United States was very much connected to the capture of Osama bin Laden. This has now been accomplished. What do you see as the value of this?
Well, too little, too late. If bin Laden had been captured early on, that would have dealt a significant blow to al-Qaeda and to what was to become the global jihad. It would have removed the leader, the person who was at some level responsible for the attacks. It would have indicated that that kind of attack was going to generate an immediate response, and the people that were responsible would be taken care of. 10 years later is too far down the road. Al-Qaeda has changed. It has become a much more decentralized form of leaderless resistance. The global jihad has taken on a life of its own. It was still important to capture or kill him. There's no doubt of that. Having accomplished it, even 10 years later, makes a difference. It sends a message that the United States will pursue the people and that there are no free passes for past action. But in terms of the global war on terrorism and the global jihad and the interaction between them, it came far too late to have an impact on the course of events. The global jihad now has a life of its own. If al-Qaeda's leadership had been decapitated very early on, if they'd been caught in the Tora Bora Mountains, there would have been some reaction, but I do not think, and this is just speculation, it would have been nearly as large and nearly as long-lasting, and it would have given pause to other groups who were thinking, or even individuals or more organized groups, participating because the response was so quick and so effective.
I can't help but want to ask about the circumstances of bin Laden's capture, because it brings another country into the mix, Pakistan. It seems almost impossible to talk about these issues without bringing up Pakistan, both in terms of our relationship with it and the implications for the future.
Well, Pakistan is a weak state. It's very weak, and clearly Americans don't understand why don't the Pakistanis just do. Well, there's lots of very good reasons why they just don't send in 50,000 troops into Waziristan. They've actually tried it. It didn't work terribly well. Well, I mean, it worked, but it has high costs for the military. It diverts resources from other places. And it tends, basically what many American citizens are saying is the first priority of the government of Pakistan should be what we think should be the first priority, and that's hardly ever the first priority of any foreign government. They have to balance a very volatile situation in their own country, the federally administered tribal areas. The British didn't administer them. When the British ruled India, they basically paid a subsidy to the tribal leaders to be quiet and to be good, and it worked. And we turn around and say, well, gee, the Pakistani government isn't a reliable ally. There are all kinds of things because they can't do what the British Empire couldn't do in its heyday. And it's an unrealistic expectation. The government has to be careful in coming down on groups that are Islamic fundamentalist as opposed to Islamic extremist because of public opinion within their own country. And currently, Pakistan has a more or less democratic government, but even under Musharraf, before it was even democratic, government leaders have to pay attention to public opinion in their own countries if they want to survive. And they have to balance what to do. Initially, Pakistan supported the U.S. in Afghanistan because the benefits far outweighed the cost. But asking the Pakistani government to crack down on internal groups that have support in one way or another is risking unrest in Pakistan, which may not even be in our best interest.
Of course, what a lot of people are wondering is whether or not something like 9/11 can happen again. In other words, are we safer today either in terms of a single event, or are we safer today in terms of those smaller events that could actually manage to take more lives over a longer period of time? Do you think we're safer?
I think we're, barring a terrorist group getting access to some kind of potent biological or chemical weapon, which if they were willing to undertake a suicide attack or were willing to die in the cause if they were about to be apprehended in a major city and they let it loose then and there on the spot, they've accomplished their goal. Barring that, which is rather unlikely but not impossible, I don't think we have to fear any kind of major one-off attack, which will, like 9/11. I think we're better prepared to watch for that kind of thing. And I think even the permissible watching of communications going in and out of the country can provide indications of when that might occur. The smaller series of attacks by isolated groups, the cumulative effect, I don't think we're safer from those. It's in part because the United States and all its representatives, including businesses and tourists and persons doing business abroad, I mean, the United States is always going to be vulnerable. You can't protect every tourist, you can't protect every corporate office, you can't protect every business, you can't protect every airline. It's impossible. And right now, many of the attacks are focused on American civilian and military personnel in Afghanistan and Iraq because that's where they're most vulnerable. But they're also vulnerable in other places that are only somewhat more difficult to get to. So I think that at least in the short term and probably into the medium future, there's going to be a continuing series of attacks, generally in some level associated with the global jihad, which will cause damage and loss of life.
So in terms of global terrorism, what have been the lessons that we learned from the attacks of 9/11?
Well, one of the lessons we probably should have learned is that better cooperation between domestic and foreign intelligence agencies is essential. Unfortunately, I don't see much indication of greater cooperation between the FBI, the CIA, and now Homeland Security. They all tend to have turf issues with each other. On the other hand, we've developed much better working relationships, near as I can tell, with foreign intelligence agencies. The Europeans have effectively increased their cooperation with each other, which has a net positive benefit for the United States because their ability to ferret out terrorist cells, not all of them, but some of them, obviously helps us as well. And working relationships with intelligence agencies, non-European countries. I think we've also, particularly from the CIA, has reoriented itself to some extent from a high-tech satellite, collect all the scientific data, which was very good for dealing with a superpower, which is not so good for dealing with isolated small organizations. They have reoriented themselves to be better able to collect vital information and intelligence about potential terrorist attacks. None are perfect, particularly because you have isolated individuals doing lone wolf attacks. You can't predict them. The Army major in Fort Hood, totally unpredictable. It cannot be predicted. The FBI has infiltrated some wannabe terrorist cells, some of which were probably not particularly dangerous, some of which were more dangerous. But the isolated individual, there's no way to predict that.
Well, Jim, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate having you in the studio. And remember, in case you want to learn more, you can always go out and pick up the books, Terrorism, the Basics. You can go out and pick up Terrorism, Origins and Evolution, and Global Terrorism, all by Jim Lutz here from the Department of Political Science at IPFW.
If, as intended, you found the interview interesting and you want to learn more about it, here are a few more recommended titles. How Terrorism Ends, Understanding the Decline and Demise of Terrorist Campaigns by Audrey Kurth Cronin, Al-Qaeda, Casting a Shadow of Terror by Jason Burke, and Terrorism versus Democracy, The Liberal State Response by Paul Wilkinson. If you want more information about some of the topics touched by Jim in his interview, we recommend Riaz Khan's Afghanistan and Pakistan, Conflict, Extremism, and Resistance to Modernity, James Castanera's Al-Qaeda Goes to College, Impact of the War on Terror on American Higher Education, and Carrie Stacy Smith's The Patriot Act, Issues and Controversies.
During each episode of Required Viewing, we're going to be introducing you to some faculty members here at IPFW who are doing research on the topic that we've been discussing. This month, we're going to be introducing you to Assistant Professor of Media Productions, Art Herbig, as well as Assistant Professor of Rhetoric, Aaron Hess. They're actually doing a project on 9/11, and first we're going to hear from Aaron to tell us a little bit about that project.
Our project is an inquiry into the memories of September 11th. Specifically, we're really curious about how it is that people are telling stories and what memorial practices they might be engaging in at the site of Ground Zero. We're expecting to interview quite a number of people to try to get as many different perspectives on the types of memories that are being offered. Specifically, we want to ask questions about what it means to do everything from visit Ground Zero and rub your hands across the memorial itself to what it means to be a first responder and to rub your hands across those same words, but in this case, it's the name of someone that you may have known. Simultaneously, I'm curious about things about vendors that might be at Ground Zero selling tchotchkes, about, here's how you can remember September 11th with your own snow globe. What does it mean to have that type of memory and take it home with you as a tourist? And so for us, the inquiry is really about all different types of memory and how they're bought, sold, traded, created, maintained, contested, anything that relates to the types of memories circulating on September 11th and this 10-year anniversary.
And now we're going to hear from Art. He's going to tell us about the trip to New York itself.
For our project, we'll be heading to New York to study memory. We'll be talking to different people who in some way are connected to the events that happened that day 10 years ago on September 11th. We're talking to volunteers as people who showed up. Some of them came from Georgia, some of them came from Oregon, but they're all returning to New York for this anniversary, and we're getting the opportunity to speak with them. We'll be talking to first responders, people who literally pulled people out of the buildings, and we've already spoken to a few of them by the phone. Some of that stuff we're hoping will be pretty powerful. That's a great opportunity to talk to people and to get their memories out there. The kind of last group of people we'll be talking to is hopefully people who are just there, someone who has a connection to the event in a way broader than having been there, having just seen it on TV. Some people are drawn to this ground. And so we're hoping to get to discuss with these people their memories and their understandings of how things went down on September 11th and how things still exist today.
Well, if you thought Art and Aaron's project sounded intriguing, you will have a chance to hear more about it when they do a presentation here at IPFW campus in early October. The date hasn't been set yet, but keep an eye out for that announcement.
There are a couple of other events people might want to know about. For example, on September 7th, here on the IPFW campus in Neff Hall at 7 o'clock, they can hear a panel discussion called Reflections on 10 Turbulent Years. That's the 7th, Wednesday the 7th at 7 o'clock in Neff. And then also in Neff Hall on September 19th at 7 o'clock, another panel discussion, this one on personal freedoms in a post-9/11 world.
And these are all UC2 events, right?
Yes, they are. You can see the address for UC2 up on the screen right there, and please check out some of the other events.
Well, moving off campus, there's going to be a 9/11 commemorative event held in Fort Wayne as well. On Saturday, September 10th, from 2 to 4 p.m., the History Center will present a program entitled Remembering 9/11. On that day, History Center staff will be on site to record oral histories or accept written histories of the event at the museum. Those interested in having their oral history recorded should call a number on the screen, 260-426-2882. These histories are going to be compiled and preserved as a permanent addition to the History Center's archival collection. And if you want more information on this and other History Center's events, you can check it out on their website, www.fwhistorycenter.com.
I love those oral histories, going back and actually hearing what people had to say and their firsthand experience. Those things are always great. Of course, we want to talk about things beyond just 9/11 type stuff. For example, this is the month when city budgets are made in most cities, and so I encourage people, if you live in a municipality, go out, actually read the newspaper articles, watch the television news, go to the meetings themselves, learn a little bit about the budget of your city.
And of course, budgets and financial matters are not simply of interest to those people interested in local politics. The state of the global economy is a matter of concern and relevance to all of us. And it will be very interesting in the upcoming months to see how, in this increasingly interconnected global economy, different countries are trying to deal with their respective economic challenges.
Yeah, that's going to be a big issue for us to watch. I want to thank everybody for joining us for this first episode of Required Viewing. This is made possible through a partnership between the Departments of History and Political Science here at IPFW, as well as CATV and the American Democracy Project. You can see episodes on CATV, but you can also catch them on MDON through the Helmke Library's webpage. Thank you very much for joining us.